As the last of the Fubukis and the first of the Ayanamis were being completed, Japan began construction of the new 1,680-ton Akatsuki class, sometimes called the Batch 3 Fubukis. Originally 10 had been planned, but with the signing of the First London Treaty, the last 6 were cancelled and redesigned as a smaller treaty-compliant class. More on that later. The major change over their predecessors was in the engine room. Whereas the previous ships had used 4 boilers in 2 rooms, these used 3 larger, higher pressure boilers, each in their own room. This would become pretty standard for Japanese destroyers. Visually, this meant the forward funnel shrank as it now only had 1 boiler venting to it, while the middle and rear ones vented to the rear funnel. Also of note was that Hibiki was the first all-welded destroyer for Japan. Generally, this would be pretty good, but if you've been paying attention, you'll realize this was actually very bad.
Akatsuki を一人前のレディとして扱ってよね。
Akatsuki was started February 17th, 1930, and was completed November 30th, 1932.
響だよ。その活躍ぶりから不死鳥の通り名もあるよ。
Hibiki was started February 21st, 1930, and was completed March 31st, 1933.
イカズチよ。雷じゃないわ。そこんとこもよろしく頼むわね。
Ikazuchi was started March 7th, 1930, and was completed August 15th, 1932.
稲妻です。どうかよろしくお願いいたします。
Inazuma was started March 7th, 1930, and was completed November 15th, 1932. Main armament was again 6 127mm 50 caliber guns in 3 twin turrets, 1 forward and 2 aft in Type B, aka 75-degree elevation, turrets. Torpedo armament was again 3 triple-tubed 610mm torpedo banks, all on the center line, 1 between the funnels and the other 2 between the rear funnel and the aft superstructure. Again, reloads were carried for the 2 aft banks. Propulsion was provided by 3 boilers in 3 longitudinal rooms, with room 1 venting to the forward funnel and the other venting to the rear funnels. These provided steam to the 2 turbines, each running a propeller, which produced 50,000 horsepower for a top speed of 38 knots. They had 1 rudder. 16 depth charges were originally carried. Modernizations were along the lines of other destroyers. In the mid to late 30s, following the Tomozuru and 4th Fleet incidents, all were taken in to reduce top weight and stiffen their frame. The funnels and bridge were lowered. Ammunition capacity was lowered from 150 to 120 rounds per gun. Permanent ballast was added, and the most heavily stressed welds were reinforced with riveting. Type 93 sonar was fitted. Along with other minor changes, this increased their standard displacement to 1,750 tons and reduced their top speed to 33 knots. In the second half of 1942, depth charge stowage was doubled to 36 and depth charge throwers were added. Hibiki and Inazuma replaced Turret 2 for more medium anti-aircraft guns and added Type 22 and 13 radar in April 1944. Akatsuki started the war through February 1942, covering the conquest of the East Indies. In March, she covered the conquest of the Philippines before returning to Japan in April. In June, she covered the conquest of the Aleutians and stayed there until the end of August. In October, she headed south and was fed into the Guadalcanal campaign, running several Tokyo expresses.
こんなところで沈むの嫌だよ。
At the overnight First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, she was shot up repeatedly before finally sinking stern first early on the 13th. Hibiki started the war through February 1942, covering the conquest of the East Indies. In March, she covered the conquest of the Philippines before returning to Japan in April. In June, she covered the conquest of the Aleutians. While doing so, on June 12th, she was heavily damaged by a near hit from a bomb that sent her back to Japan. With repairs completed at the start of November 1942, she spent from then until May 1943 escorting convoys as they sailed from Japan to Truk and back. In May 1943 through September, she headed north again and supported the evacuation of the Aleutians. After that, she mostly escorted convoys from the East Indies to Japan, breaking to cover the support tankers at the June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she was lightly damaged. Off Takeo on September 5, 1944, she was hit by the submarine Hake, nearly taking her bow off and heavily damaging her frame. Finally limping into Japan in mid-November 1944, she was essentially written off and post-war was dumped on the Soviets. Akatsuki spent December 1941 as part of the Hong Kong invasion force before moving on to the East Indies until March, when she returned to Japan. In June, she covered the conquest of the Aleutians and stayed there until the end of August. In October, she headed south and was fed into the Guadalcanal campaign, running several Tokyo expresses. At the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, she got pretty beat up, so had to go back to Japan. With repairs completed in late February 1943, she was sent north until March 30th, when she was damaged in a collision, sending her back to Japan. With repairs completed at the start of May 1943, she mostly escorted convoys from the East Indies to Japan.
司令官、どこ？もう声が聞こえないわ。
Southeast of Guam, on April 13, 1944, she was torpedoed by the submarine Harder, detonating her depth charges as she sunk. Inazuma spent December 1941 as part of the Hong Kong invasion force before moving on to the East Indies until March, when she returned to Japan. In June, she covered the conquest of the Aleutians and stayed there until the end of August. In October, she headed south and was fed into the Guadalcanal campaign, running several Tokyo expresses and taking part in both naval battles of Guadalcanal. From late November, she continued to run supplies around the Solomons and New Guinea before returning to Japan in mid-January 1943. At the start of May 1943, she mostly escorted convoys from Japan to Truk and back until the end of 1943. At the start of 1944, she began escorting convoys from Japan to the East Indies and back.
次に生まれてくるときは、平和な世界だといいな。
Off Tawi Tawi, on May 14, 1944, she was torpedoed by the submarine Bonefish, blew up, and sank.